Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about trans women in sports, but I'm not really just talking about trans women in sports, because there's a lot more to it than that. Trans women in women's sports, that's just kind of one of the wedge issues that transphobes like to use to try and pull people who have no intentional malice against trans people to their side. I mean, after all, while things like calling for the eradication of transgenderism are perfectly acceptable, defensible, and even encouraged by strong supporters of the Republican Party, most normal, empathetic people find it a bit off-putting to want whole groups of people eradicated. But there's plenty of normal, empathetic people who have concerns about the fairness of allowing trans women to participate in women's sports. After all, it's undeniable that men are currently outperforming women in the top tiers of most sports. And trans women did have biological similarities to men when they were born. So it's not unreasonable to have concerns about fairness. And if you happen to be one of those normal, empathetic people who has no problem with trans people, maybe you even support trans rights, but you do have concerns about trans women competing in women's sports, then you happen to be exactly who I'd like to talk to right now. And don't get me wrong, I don't think I'll change your mind. It'd be nice if I did, but that's not really my goal here. But anyway, before I go on, I'd like to make a simple statement that I think any normal, empathetic person can agree with. It's okay for trans people to exist. Now, if this isn't something that we can just immediately agree on right now, then I'm sorry, but you can just F the H off, because I have no interest in trying to talk to someone who needs to be convinced, who has even a shred of doubt that it's okay for trans people to exist. And I mean, I hope people who don't just get that figure it out, but I unfortunately don't have the capacity to try and reasonably talk to a person who hears it's okay for trans people to exist and doesn't just immediately agree. Went on for a bit there. Well, anyway, back to talking about trans women in sports. And I'd like to start with a clarification. There are no major or minor sporting organizations that allow any trans woman, that allow just any trans woman to compete in women's sports. Trans women, in reality, in this world, only have restricted access to women's sports. And the higher the level of women's sport, generally the more strict the restrictions on that access will be. And this is despite what people who clearly don't think it's okay for trans people to exist may imply. There are no women's sporting organizations where a man or boy can just throw on a dress and start competing against women. For a trans woman to compete in women's sports, especially at the higher levels, she's generally going to have undergone a significant amount of medical treatment. And based on what little science there is right now, that significant amount of medical treatment generally does impact their athletic performance. And even in the low levels, like Little League or elementary school, there might not be these, formal requirements for medical tests or stuff, but there's also, like, even in your most liberal whatever state, a 5-year-old boy isn't just going to throw on a dress and start playing sports against 5-year-old girls. Like, they would actually have to have been living as a trans girl for a significant amount of time. And, you know, like, this kind of thing, this, like, reality is something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of when they're talking about trans women in women's sports. So, you know, I just want to make sure we get that, you know, understood, I guess. But, you know, then again, like I said, I'm not really here to talk about just trans women in women's sports, which might have you asking, what am I here to talk about? Well, you know, I might have given a few clues there earlier. It's the fact that it's okay for trans people to exist. Because, and I'm pretty sure you figured this out by now, I really think it's not just okay, but actually super duper great for trans people to exist. I think it's so okay for trans people to exist that I even think it's okay for trans women to exist in women's sports. See what I did there? Pretty clever. Now, anyway, to be clear, I'm not saying if you have concerns about trans women participating in women's sports that you're some big transphobe who doesn't think it's okay for trans people to exist. I mean, it's okay to have concerns about fairness. I have concerns about fairness. They might not be the same concerns. Like, for example, I think it's very unfair for trans children to be systematically excluded from the social and emotional development that participation in low-level, like Little League, elementary school sports can provide. And, you know, to be clear real quick, anyone who has a problem with the existence of trans children, yeah, they're also in that F write the H off category. Sorry, not sorry. Anyway, like I said, it's not unreasonable to have concerns about the fairness of letting trans women participate in sports, especially with the undeniable statistical disparity in the performance of top-level men and women in sports. But here's the thing. That statistical disparity is between cis men and cis women. Real quick vocab, by the way. Cis just means not trans, okay? It's not a slur or anything like that. It's just a way so you kind of know what I'm talking about. And, you know, I also get that there's kind of this mistaken notion that trans women aren't really women. You know, that's been around in our culture forever. To be honest, like, I once held that notion, and, you know, while I'm pretty sure most people can agree that it's okay for trans people to exist, those of us who've come to understand that trans women are real women might not necessarily be such a large majority. But, you know, that's a whole nother conversation, and that's not really what I'm talking about right now. But I will say that while the mistaken notion that trans women aren't real women is harmful because it's dangerously close to thinking that trans women aren't real people, there's really nothing inherently wrong with not understanding that trans women are real women. You know, I mean, just like there's nothing inherently wrong with not understanding calculus or geometry. You know, these things can be complicated, and, you know, it's okay to be unfamiliar with the current scientific understanding of gender. Just, you know, a thing. But in any case, none of that's really important to my point, because whether or not you understand that trans women are real women, it's indisputable that trans women are not cis men. You know, all these statistics about men's records, like, none of those records were set by trans women, you know, and I don't know, to me, it seems like if we're concerned about the fairness of letting trans women compete against women, isn't it the records of trans women that we should be looking at? And so really, whether or not you believe trans women are real women, as long as you believe that trans women are real people and that all people deserve fairness and empathy, I think you can maybe kind of get my point. So what are the statistics when it comes to trans women in sports? Well, it turns out there's so few trans women who participate in women's sports that there's not really a statistically significant amount of data. But, you know, that doesn't mean we don't have any information. Like, you know, a couple of years ago, I was trying to, like, figure this out, and I saw in an article an estimate that there were at least 50 trans women participating in college-level sports across the country. And, you know, one of those 50 women, Leah Thomas, she broke some school swimming record. You know, there might have been a brief point in time when she was actually the #1 women's college swimmer, but it certainly didn't last any large amount of time, and she never really got to do anything after college because the Olympics had some sort of rule change I don't know a whole lot about, so you'll probably have to find that out on your own. But it basically kind of excluded her specific version of trans woman. I think it had something to do with when she started receiving hormone therapy. You know, but that's, you know, 1 out of 50 trans women. And I can tell you for sure that the other 49 pretty much didn't do squat, because we're talking about, like, not really a major, like, achievement in women's swimming that we all knew about because she was a trans woman. So, like, you know, just a thing. But anyway, to me, if, you know, 1 out of 50 trans women participating in college sports manages to, like, win something once and do okay for a couple of weeks, you know, or not just okay, pretty good, maybe even top of the world. You know, I think if that makes you worried that the already restricted access trans women have to women's sports, well, you know, I'm not sure if a person who thinks like that is necessarily worried so much about the fairness that trans people deserve, like all people. You know, so, like, what I'm saying is, like, it's, you know, it's not unreasonable to have concerns that even the restricted access we currently have for trans women in women's sports, you know, that even that could be unfair. That's not an unreasonable concern. But that doesn't mean there's an actual problem. You know, just like it's not unreasonable to have a fear of flying. You know, I mean, airplanes are clearly a lot denser than air, and, you know, like 10,000 feet or however high up they are, if you fall there, like, that's not going to be good. But that doesn't mean it's not actually safe to fly. So, you know, I can understand how, you know, you might get the impression that all trans women just overperform in women's sports, because, I mean, the only time we hear about one in the media they've done something. Like, I mean, not necessarily always won. There was Laurel Hubbard, who only qualified to compete in the 2020 Olympics. And, whoo, boy, that was a discussion we got to have for like 3 months after that, even though she didn't even she finished like dead last, so I'm pretty sure how she finished. But her competing was enough for some people to have big problems with her being there. So you don't really see the news stories about the trans woman who competes in college sports and really just makes a bunch of friends along the way. Not a thing that pops up a lot. So let's try and remember that handful of trans women made infamous by certain elements of the media, and I'm not just looking at you, right-wing media. Those who actually win like one thing are a tiny fraction of all the trans women and girls who are trying to compete in women's sports and competing in women's sports and just get to like play sports. So to me, that makes the question, does the existence of a handful of trans women who manage to achieve some level of greatness in the otherwise cis-dominated world of women's sports mean there's actually a problem with allowing them the already restricted access they have to women's sports? Now, I know there's a lot of people who want us to think that this is like a big problem, but I just find it hard to believe that someone who thinks it is, that trans women are real people who truly deserve fairness and compassion just as much as any cis woman does. I find it hard to think that would be a problem to these people. And so this is sort of what I was talking about when I'm talking about how that mistaken notion that trans women aren't women can be dangerously close to the idea that they're not real people. It can be so easy for a person who doesn't recognize trans women as real women to completely overlook this big old group of real people. Maybe not all the people, but definitely a lot. And they all deserve fairness just as much as anybody else. And every time any one of them does anything in women's sports, we get to have this big conversation about maybe we should just completely exclude those people from sports because someday there might be some cis women who feel unable to participate if we don't start excluding them right now. And, if you're my target audience, like I said, I don't think I've necessarily laid all your concerns about trans women and women's sports to rest, but I hope I've given you something to think about. Maybe kind of try and look into things on your own. I'll also have some references at the end of this, maybe. But, one last thing I want to say. If you think it's okay for trans people to exist, but maybe not in women's sports, please just think very carefully about how many buts you're willing to add to that statement. It's okay for trans people to exist. Because there's people who think it isn't okay for trans people to exist. But they're not going to say that because they know most of us would not agree with them on that. So instead, they'll say things like, it's okay for trans people to exist, but not in public bathrooms, or it's okay for trans people to exist, but not trans children. Or it's okay for trans people to exist, but not around children. Or it's okay for trans people to exist, but not in public. And then before you know it, so many buts have been added to that statement, it's okay for trans people to exist, that they're not really saying it's okay for trans people to exist. In fact, they're saying it's not okay for trans people to exist. And to me, that's just not an okay thing to be saying. Well, anyway, if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to know about trans people and trans issues, this mostly cis dude probably isn't your best source of information, but there's plenty of trans creators who could give you a much greater depth and just would have much more to say because they're speaking from personal experience. Some of my favorites are Jessie Gender, who does really good deep dives into trans issues and is really one of the most empathetic content creators I've ever seen. And then there's Blaque. She doesn't necessarily specifically center trans issues as much, but is just, kind of likes to gossip or dish the tea or whatever you kids are calling it these days. And, then there is Lily, I believe, Simpson, who does very, very good, kind of analyses of trans representation in different pop culture phenomenon, like the Golden Girls or South Park, and how the different trans episodes of those shows kind of reflected their attitudes or different stereotypes or things like that. And then there's the last one is Alexander Avila, who, honestly, I didn't even know that he was trans until I saw their video about it. Because, he mostly kind of talks of, pop culture, what's going on Twitter, or things kind of like that, I guess, once again, what the kids are into these days. Anyway, links to those people and maybe a few others who I can think of when I make it will be in the description.